Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It is afternoon. I'm happy to be back, and I just have a couple of, I guess, housekeeping questions. Amanda, will you jump in if there are questions from the comments?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, great. So I am going to move kind of right into the presentation here, but feel free to stop me anytime. And for those of you watching and following along, we will have some follow-up handouts and materials that will go out to you from the GLAR office, including a lot of the slides to refer back to and some of the HUD guidance that I'll be referencing as well. So in case you didn't participate or weren't available in April, my name is Liz Keegan. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. We are a private nonprofit. We are located in Grand Rapids, but we cover a large amount of Michigan, especially in providing education to the housing industry. We are really interested in preventing housing discrimination in the first place, wherever possible, however possible. And we do that through providing a lot of education and outreach, as well as conducting some investigation and assisting in enforcement to the best of our ability. We are a nonprofit organization though, so we don't have enforcement authority. That allows us to kind of be in the middle between the industry and home seekers to help mitigate fair housing questions and issues. And I really appreciate GLAR's commitment to fair housing and interest in education, because you know, the reason that I'm still doing this some almost 20 years later is that I really believe that where you live impacts directly how you live. In our modern communities, in our modern neighborhoods, you know, where we live really dictates the quality of life that we have. So freedom to choose, that is very important. And advertising is really the first step in finding housing and communicating about housing opportunities. So I appreciate the interest and the invitation to talk about this directly. So first I'm going to share a couple of scenarios or some language, and this is not going to be a formal poll, but you'll see I have some yes/no animation that will come along to let us know whether or not this is a fair housing issue. So that's something that you can just follow along with and vote privately at home or jump on the comments if you wish, but I'll be moving fairly quickly. I just wanted to kind of start with some of the examples to kick off the conversation, so to speak. I'll spend some time on where the law is addressing advertising and communication, but really spend a little bit more time on descriptions of spaces, the use of human models, talk about social media, of course, and share some best practices along the way. I'll try to save time at the end for questions. And I understand there will be an evaluation sent out, and that's something I'd really appreciate if you would take a few minutes to share thoughts and ideas, ways we can improve, what I can do differently. I really appreciate that feedback. So our first question here, I'm approaching these more about, is this a fair housing issue? And I look at it as, do you see some fair housing risk here in this statement? So in our first scenario, we've got a woman helping her parents look for housing. She hears an advertisement for a community selling smaller homes that seems like a good fit, until the ad ends with a statement that it's a 55 and older community. So is there any fair housing risk, or is this a fair housing issue? And I'm going to go ahead and reveal that no, it's okay to have age restrictions as long as they are in compliance with Housing for Older Persons, or HOPA standards, one of which is the 55 and older standard. Another one is 62 and older. So that's something that I really encourage, especially homeowners associations, condos associations. We see a lot of incorrect and illegal age restrictions. So that's something that they tend to get wrong. And sometimes we'll see 50 and older, and that's not in compliance. The only two age restrictions we can have here in Michigan are 55 and older or 62 and older. So this ad is in compliance with that standard. Here's a listing that says home features a man cave in the detached garage. I'll give you a moment to think about a man cave, and also a hint to think about our protected classes. This is something that generated a lot of conversation. I guess now I can update it with the she shed, which is a little difficult to say. The she shed situation that I see advertised on TV now. In our opinion, in a very conservative standpoint, we would say there is fair housing risk here. Oops, my slide to move for me, because it references gender, and we train and promote very conservative standards and high risk management. So we would say avoid referencing any protected class, even if it doesn't feel like a direct preference. People can file complaints based on how they feel they were treated. And so we would say having any sort of gender reference that's not specific to an allowed exemption that I'll talk about in a bit is a risk. It leaves that door open. So why not eliminate that door and that risk? And in terms of advertising perspective, I'm not an advertising professional. I'm not a lawyer. I can't give legal advice. But man cave is a broad term now. There are so many things that could be incorporated into that space. I feel that it's better to provide detail about what exactly is in that space. Is it a gaming room? Is it a movie theater? Is there a pool table that's going to be left behind with the house? You know, be specific and share some of those details so that we better understand what exactly that space is. In this particular instance, this was a room that had heat and cable wiring for a large screen television added. And I think that would have been more helpful to share that information than just calling it a man cave.
Hey, Liz.
Yeah.
If there's like a sign in the basement that says man cave on the wall, do you recommend agents removing that sign before any photos are taken of that space to be put in the MLS?
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. You know, that's a great question with artifacts and personal mementos. You know, I'm already going to say err on the side of caution. And, you know, I can picture the homeowner maybe not wanting to do that, or maybe not understanding why that would be necessary. And I would say, you know, a great explanation for that is to say, we want to cast the broadest net to, you know, find the most qualified buyers that are going to have the best offers. So we want to declutter and remove anything that might discourage someone from pursuing the housing opportunity. You know, as I mentioned, we had a robust debate about this in the fair housing community. And there were a number of female gamers who said, you know, those are spaces that they would be very interested in, but maybe would find a sign like that. You know, it would just be there in the back of their mind, or maybe make them think that that's not the right fit for them. So I think there's a great selling argument to be made there too.
And that kind of replies to religious symbols that may or may not be up on the wall as well. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that that's very wise. It kind of depends on, you know, if it's something that can be easily removed, that doesn't create a disruption maybe, or, you know, I would say it's a case-by-case piece. You know, it depends on, like I said, if it can be easily removed or not, but I'm a fan of decluttering and really encouraging the homeowner, the seller, to create a space where other people could visualize themselves being able to move in. So that does, I hope, create the space where they could say, okay, I want to remove things that are personal to me and really make this as beautiful and appealing as possible and streamlined as possible. And that would include removing some things, and also things that are very valuable just from a common sense point of view. You know, especially if the pictures are going to be going online, or now in the day of a lot of video touring. You know, those are things that they would probably want to walk through each space and think about what they would not want out there, and also what they could remove to really create that vision of somebody else wanting to move into that space. So hopefully that's helpful.
We also talk about, for MLS photos, making sure that you're not taking a photo of the religious memorabilia.
Yeah. You know, if it's part of a whole room shot and it's not, you know, the glaring blinking arrow, you know, that I think is totally fine. So that's what I mean. It's really a case-by-case assessment. You know, I've seen there's a trend of quotes and sayings, psalms even on the walls, things along those lines, you know, can be really large and obvious. So those maybe are a little bit more difficult to remove, but maybe the photo can be posed to where it's part of the scenery and not the focus, exactly like you said. So I'm gonna hop along here. We've got a 3-bedroom home, perfect for the busy or near retirement couple. And I hope many of you are already saying, oh, I do see an issue here. Yes, because it's the perfect for phrase that we really, really encourage listings to not include that kind of terminology. If really I'm trying to challenge myself right now. It's really challenging to finish that sentence and talk about a group of people without touching on a protected class. So we really discourage referencing groups of people. Even if they're not protected specifically, you want to weigh that carefully. So the perfect for, ideal for phrasing is definitely a red flag, and you want to really challenge yourself to think about what you can say differently that wouldn't include narrowing that audience. And here, this is a real ad, and a 3-bedroom home is typically something that multi-generational families or families that are looking to expand, all kinds of people are interested in that size of home, and narrowing this market with this type of preference or creating this profile for the busy or retired couple, again, can push people away from pursuing the housing opportunity. In a market like this, we're being flooded, I hear, with lots of offers and things still moving fairly quickly in spite of the public health issues that we're working within. So we really want to, think about in terms of when the market is maybe not so hot, that you do want to cast that broad net. Even in a hot market, you want the best offer. And so that means not discouraging anyone. Here we've got ABC Community, 3 to 4 bedroom homes. They're available for purchase, shops, restaurants, new city park nearby, energy efficient, move-in ready, open floor plan, lots of natural light throughout, landscaping maintenance included. Is this a fair housing issue? This is an ad that I say does a nice job following that emphasis of not talking about the people or who it's perfect or ideal for. It shares some neutral information about what's nearby and some nice language about the benefits, having maintenance, the open floor plan, natural light, it's ready to go, it's energy efficient. Those are all great things to promote that are not tied to people. Here we've got a homeowner that you're working with to sell their condo. They want the advertisement to include a statement that support animals are not welcome because the community has a no pet policy. And this is continuing to be one of our hottest topics, and I've actually come across several agents who have been put in this position. They're condo sellers that have been on the board or were involved in conversations about animals and no pet communities, and they want to really discourage anyone with a disability who has a support animal from pursuing the housing. And that's not okay. I would say that this is a real issue, and there is risk to discouraging potential buyers who have support animals because of a disability. Here we have a beautiful 2-bedroom home, open floor plan available now. Side door has a ramp, master bathroom has barrier-free shower with grab bars, updated kitchen, new roof, large fenced-in backyard. Is this a fair housing issue? Any risks here? Now, I was talking about some accessible features, which might seem targeted towards people with disabilities, but actually HUD has said that you can directly discuss and promote accessible features, not the person or the people that would be perfect for the home, but the features as amenities themselves. And this is something that I've heard anecdotally from several real estate agents that I work with that, when they've worked with people looking for accessible features and buying homes, it's a real tough gem of a house to find. And there's a competitive market for them. The last one I can think of, there were 4 offers within the pool that happened to come from wheelchair users or families with wheelchair users. It was a ranch home that had some modifications, but was really a nice layout to make more. And she was representing a person also using a wheelchair, and it was a hot bidding war for that home. And she was really struggling to find something that would work for her buyer. But if you do have accessible features in a listing, that is something that you can include as long as you're talking about the features themselves. So why does all of this matter? Well, really it's the early step in accessing housing. So this is something that I think is really important to pay attention to in terms of you know, good business practice, but also there's of course legal considerations to making sure that any communication or advertisements are in compliance with fair housing. It's a lens that I would say is an important one to kind of add to your to-do list. Failure to properly screen ads or supervise staff that might be covering for someone else. You know, that's where we've seen some mistakes made and some information get put out that was found to be discriminatory or limiting. So that puts people in the position of having to defend, you know, what happened and how the communication wasn't supposed to be discriminatory, and that can be very hard to do. It comes from this paragraph here in the law. This is from the 1968 Fair Housing Act under the Civil Rights Act. It addressed housing. It gave us our first 4 protected classes. But this paragraph here, it's called Section 804. It's a really important piece of fair housing law that creates a broad space where ads, statements, verbal communication, notices, documents, in regard to sale or rental of housing, if it has a preference, if it has a limit, or it's discriminatory, whether it was intended to be or not, this paragraph here creates that liability. So this is go ahead.
I think we have a question that relates exactly to what you're talking about.
Okay.
Is it okay to put in agent-to-agent remarks in the MLS? Seller requests that everyone remove their shoes when touring the house for religious reasons. Seller keeps the floor very clean.
Agent to agent, meaning that's not a public
Right.
comment? Okay. So I'm not an active user, so I want to make sure I'm understanding the parameters of that. Yeah, I mean, if that is something that the public doesn't see and they feel that it's, you know, just simply stating that taking shoes off is required is maybe not enough to get people to comply. I think that that would be okay, to especially encourage and expand upon the reasoning to help people, you know, the other agents comply with the wishes of the homeowner. That makes sense to me. I think that does make me want to bring up a case that some of you may have heard about. It was a West Michigan case from a number of years ago where a broker hosting an open house refused to let a woman put a portable ramp down and bring her husband in to tour the property. And she was an attorney being recruited to Michigan from Texas. So she was very well versed in different types of law, and of course was an advocate for her husband. And this case settled on the eve of trial, and a number of the defenses that were not shared on the day of the incident that came up later were, you know, well, the builder's picky about the floors, or I had another appointment that I had to get to. But their experience in that day, in that moment, was that they were not allowed to put the ramp down and for him to come in to the home for sale. So when it comes to disability and, you know, deviating from your normal standards, which are fine, especially if they're applied consistently across the board, you know, we have to tuck that away in the back of our minds that when it comes to access related to a disability, we have to do more and maybe deviate from our normal standards because that's required from the law. So thinking through in advance or having a conversation with that person with those requests related to their religion, you know, what would happen if they received a request from someone when we can go through and tour homes again from someone in a wheelchair? Would they be willing to accommodate that? If that's something that they're really not interested in doing, then the housing, you know, has to otherwise be made available for inspection to that potential buyer. So, you know, I think we're learning a lot again about video tours and pictures. They also may be somebody who's not able to get out and about too much. So that may be something that could be offered as well. the bottom line endpoint should be comparable access to information and ability to inspect. And thankfully, technology really allows us to do that with live streaming, FaceTime. You know, there's all kinds of platforms where somebody could be in the home, enabling that individual who's not there to have great information about the housing opportunity. So this piece of the law, again, has been broadly interpreted. It is not just traditional advertising in terms of that word itself. It's written oral notices, statements. It expands to communication between parties, websites, documents, as I said, signs, banners, you name it. This is it's a short paragraph, but a big impact. And part of the challenges with advertising is it can be confusing. And I think another challenge with advertising is that, you know, words are, an interpretation of words can be very subjective. So it's worth the extra time and attention to kind of run your proposed language by a number of people if you can, kind of workshop it around. That's something we ourselves do in the office. Kind of share the language and kind of sit back and let them interpret for you what they're hearing or seeing. It helps us better understand how it might be received in the public. And even if a property has an exemption, like a senior community, they are still not allowed to discriminate in their advertising. So even if a 62 and older community that you could buy into, even though they have that exemption, they cannot advertise, you know, no kids. So one of the things that our center does offer is review of language or campaigns. We prefer to have the entire piece in its final draft with all of the context, because that's another element that's so important. Context matters. And again, just reiterating that this section of the law covers not only the advertising in the sense of promotional information, newspaper or internet ads, but those communications and verbal statements made here as well. How do you decide? I mean, even in the guidance, it's challenging, it's subjective, like I said. One of the tests, quote unquote, that has been developed over time, you know, if words or phrases are given their common meaning, an ordinary reader would believe that members of a protected class are being discriminated against regarding the housing in question is one of the standards applied. But that's not a yes, no, use this, don't do this. It's a case-by-case analysis, which again can create a lot of that gray space. But I strongly encourage anyone who is drafting language or considering sharing language, if you have any doubts, don't push send or purchase that ad or post that language or, you know, blast it out until you've had a chance to do that fair housing review and really pick it apart, or reach out to us if you have further questions. It's best to wait and do it right the first time. There is a small exception for roommates and shared living spaces related to gender. You can, and you may see language that basically says a female seeking a female roommate or male seeking male roommate. The HUD guidance has not kept up with the times, where it's more about finding someone to share living space who will pay on time and be a good companion and follow maybe the similar lifestyle and same rules, versus the, you know, same gender seeking situation that they were addressing some time ago. It hasn't kept up really with the times, but that's the only current exception allowed. You know, if I'm a female seeking a female roommate, I can place that language out there, but I can't add any other caveats except for my gender preference. And again, this is really meant for people that will be roommates or sharing kitchen and bathroom areas in their living. So a lot of the guidance comes from HUD, and so any of my quote marks here in the next few slides are coming directly from the Achtenberg memo. Roberta Achtenberg was the HUD secretary that issued this guidance in the mid-1990s. So this is directly from that time frame, and it hasn't been updated since. There have been cases that have expanded the application of Section 804 to the internet, but the HUD guidance itself is basically how do their investigators evaluate claims of discrimination, and they give us a few specific examples. They are a little bit dated. I don't think we would necessarily see a bachelor apartment anymore, but you never know. As soon as I say that, you know, we'll get a question or maybe find a listing that says something along those lines. But they also talk about mother-in-law suites. Those are spaces that extra apartment type add-ons that are actually coming back into popularity now as people look to increase density and care for aging parents and grandparents. But again, because there is a reference there that's tied to gender and family, is there a different way that we could phrase and describe what those spaces are? You know, a guest room suite is a nice way to be a little more inclusive. And the other thing that we get questions about is less so now, but especially when I first started, we got questions about, can I use the phrase master bedroom? And this guidance explicitly says using that terminology is not a violation based on sex or race discrimination provisions of the law. There are certain descriptors that have developed over time that have become accepted standards for how we describe living spaces. Family room is another one. We commonly describe family rooms in homes. And that's something that is an understood industry term versus interpreted as a preference. So even the guidance from HUD says describing the property, services, facilities, and neighborhoods is, you know, in general not going to be facially discriminatory and violate the act. They also give us, you know, again, these explicit examples: master bedroom, rare find, desirable neighborhood. Those are things that they would not accept complaints on under this guidance. This is a couple of, well, 3 examples here where we have actually had issues where the language was tied to limiting the number of people or creating an occupancy restriction that the housing would be available to. This first one was a really interesting large home, 6 bedrooms, available, beautiful historic home, and they wanted to limit it to 4 individuals to share that space. Generally in a home that size and at that age point, the rooms would probably be big enough to hold 1 or 2 people apiece, so that 4-person limit is much lower than what occupancy standards or property maintenance code would allow for. We also see a lot of communities, rental and sale, limiting people by bedroom. And that's, again, something that really should be verified by property maintenance or local occupancy code standards. We actually had a volunteer involved with a fair housing center be told here at this last example that she had too many children to buy into that condo community, but they were willing to grandfather her in because she was single. So the number of heartbeats was okay with them, even though it was a different family makeup than what they preferred. And honestly, she could have fit her entire household plus 1 more according to occupancy, and that standard that they were imposing was illegal based on the number, and then of course their preference on the makeup of the family. And that did not jeopardize the sale. She was able to purchase and move in, but what she later learned was that the family that she bought from was pushed out and sold unwillingly because they had a 3rd child, but the mom and dad were still together. So they were pushed out of that community and kind of forced to sell. They didn't know their fair housing rights, which was really an unfortunate situation. So, and that's something we can assist educating condo board members on if that's a barrier. We've intervened on behalf of lots of real estate agents that we've worked with. We can either provide the information to the agent to educate the board or work with the board directly. And sometimes we'll be on a call with both parties to help revise and get the correct language out there, the correct policies in place, and hopefully get the home back on the market and sold. As far as disability status, this is something, again, that HUD has said you can describe accessible features. And you don't want to describe the party or the people, of course, but you can describe those features and be sensitive and use caution when describing the property. And really something just in general that we encourage is allowing people with disabilities to determine what property works best for them. So they need to inform you of what their limits might be versus choices being removed on their behalf without consulting them. So again, review any language for explicit exclusions, limitations. Sometimes we find this in policy documents. We see a lot of no assistance animal languages. I've actually seen a condo bylaw that banned seeing eye dogs specifically, and of course that's not going to hold up under federal disability protections. Sometimes we get questions, especially with the current interest on behalf of a lot of folks and maybe some of the younger buyers, but I'd say there's just a general interest in walkable neighborhoods or moving into communities that have amenities that people can visit by bike and by walking. So we've gotten questions about whether or not it's offensive to include language about walkability. And that's certainly something we can help with on a case-by-case basis. But here directly in that second bullet point, these are examples that HUD themselves gave about things that are not violations of the Act. And that third bullet point there talks about how you can talk about behavior required and conduct required, but again, you want to be cautious not to talk about people or groups of people. And again, there that permission to describe accessible features is granted there. Those are some of the more concrete examples, but we've collected over the years a number of words that I think create an implied preference, and here's some of them. It really depends on the context of the entire sentence or the entire ad of how these words are used. But it's important to really think about the ripple effects, as I call it, or any limits that might be created by language. We see active and independent in a lot of communities that are geared towards older adults, but they are not allowed to screen on whether or not somebody has a disability or the level of their disability if they're independent living. So those are red flags when that promotional language is included. Stable is often used as a way to evaluate someone's mental health. Executive, restricted, those may actually be factually based terms. There may be membership restrictions, for example, in buying into a community. And if that's part of the buying process, I would want to communicate that very clearly instead of using kind of a broad term, we'll see executive housing. To me, that creates confusion. Oftentimes behind it, we'll see a preference for people who are working and not on any other non-employment related income. Same thing with professional. The traditional / family values, we see those types of coded words implying a preference for people that are not homosexual or maybe two individuals of the same sex raising children together. Things along those lines. That language has been coded to push or isolate those groups out. And sometimes we'll even see references to whether or not somebody is mobile or able to care for the property. And again, that would be tied to disability. So it's very, very subjective, and it does depend on the final phrasing, but we really encourage relying on facts, being as clear as possible, while also knowing that you have to create an interesting advertisement that will catch someone's eye and trigger that interest in pursuing the opportunity. So my overarching rule of thumb, describe the property, not the people, over and over and over again. When in doubt, take it out, don't use it, do your homework. You know, even if you're hearing feedback that you may not agree with, you really want to keep the evaluation in the framework of a risk assessment. Why spend time on defending yourself against a complaint when you could change the language and move on? Briefly on human models, you know, this is something that we do see in a variety of new developments or targeted communities like senior communities. The pictures are a direct reflection of who the advertiser is trying to attract, and we can see them used oftentimes in a discriminatory way, and that is something that the guidelines say you cannot do. So I'll share a few examples here. Again, kind of picking on senior housing today, but it is something that we have seen over and over many years. There's lots of images that are not diverse racially or ethnically or even inclusive of people with physical disabilities. It is very easy to find photo after photo, especially even free ones, that don't represent that diversity that would be required in a human model campaign under fair housing guidelines. Conversely, it takes more work to find inclusive images, and in some cases we've actually had to purchase images in order to reflect the diversity that we want to be sure to include as we practice what we teach. So it's not a ban on using human models, but it does create a space where it might take more work and effort and intentionality. So there's really two choices that you have. You can prohibit the use of human models and focus on the housing itself, the amenities themselves, or you can intentionally use human models and be very inclusive and do that extra work to make sure it's a campaign that would, you know, pass fair housing muster. If you choose to use human models, you want to look at racial and ethnic diversity, look at gender diversity, different family makeups. You know, there's all kinds of facets of the protected classes that could be included. The challenge again goes back to, you know, how do we test this? How do we know that this is a good example of what to do or what not to do? And the guidelines say, you know, it's something that if you're looking at and evaluating human models, it's something that should be clearly definable, meaning that somebody can look at the materials and quickly and easily discern that that is a person of color, for example, or that is a person with a disability. This is, you know, something that we've learned over the years trying to work with communities that were reported to us for not having inclusive marketing campaigns. And one particular memorable conversation, well, that one couple on page 16, they're actually Armenian. You know, in a black and white brochure, you can't quickly and easily discern any of that diversity. We've been told, well, we use actual residents. You know, not being inclusive in portraying who lives there actually brought a person of color to report that community to us. Even though they were actual residents, there was no diversity within the resident base and therefore in the campaign, and that backfired. And even working with professional advertisers, they may not be aware of fair housing obligations or be well versed in that. So if you have the benefit of working with professional advertising professionals, that's something to ask them and to document their response to and their familiarity with. If they're not familiar, you may need to be that voice to say, we know it's camera ready artwork, but hey, we've got to include this group is totally missing, or this protected class is nowhere to be found, things along those lines. So it does take that intentionality in that work. Here's an example of a proposed development that didn't come to fruition in Michigan. They coded it as a professional neighborhood. This out-of-state developer further defined that as young professionals, 25 to 35 years old, most without children. Well, we have age protections here in the state of Michigan, so that bullet point there is a red flag and a risk right there. And then, you know, families with children are protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act and have been since 1988. So we actually were mailed these postcards by many residents in the neighborhood who had a lot of questions about what this professional neighborhood would be and who would be welcome. So that was an interesting educational opportunity. As I said, the development didn't come together for a number of reasons, but this first introduction of it to the public really, I'm sure, wasn't helpful to that, not moving forward. For social media, that Section 804 and the general principles, even though it's a 1968 and 1988 law when advertising was a different animal and the internet didn't even exist in the 60s, these constructs still apply. If you're advertising online, you have to be very clear that the platform that you're using, the settings cannot discriminate for you. If they do, like Facebook was allowing for so long, there's liability there. Hopefully Facebook is continuing to refine their process to where the discrimination that their filters were allowing and actually requiring aren't there anymore. But you want to know your protected classes based on where you're working, and be very inclusive across all protected classes. And even when you're not using human models necessarily, but using animated characters, avatars, illustrations, any content that is about people, if you're going to use it, needs to be inclusive. And be aware of reviewing posts, especially if it's specific to an open house or a home for sale, that it's couched as available to all and not as a subgroup, especially if it's eliminating people who are in a protected class. You want to avoid, again, references to the people and any protections, and focus on the property and the amenities. And in general, as a campaign, as a presence on social media, you do want to have that fair housing lens and think about what you're posting, sharing, monitoring comments for things that might be a risk under fair housing. And then proactively displaying equal housing opportunity logo, fair housing information, fair housing education information. You can include that in your campaign on social media. You may want to think about a social media policy that talks about the steps that you take to comply and include fair housing in your social media presence. It comes down to documentation of who can prove what in fair housing complaints, especially administrative complaints. So we really want to help have something that you can refer back to show your intent to comply and what you do to comply should you ever be challenged. I'm hopeful that buyer love letters, as they used to be called, where people seeking homes disclose a ton of private information about themselves, including almost all of the protected classes, age, family status, marital status, where they work, where they worship, just their whole life history in an attempt to find a home. We see risk in those being shared across the home sale process. And I've also seen them as social media posts. So that's why I included them here. It becomes,
I think, Liz, that goes the other way too, when sellers post everything that they love about their house, except they talk about how close it is to their favorite church, or the great family gatherings and how everybody in the neighborhoods we see on both sides, and our legal counsel has advised that those shouldn't be used on either side of the transaction, either as the seller or the buyer.
That's great to hear that it's so clearly, the guidance is so clearly shared for your membership. And are you still seeing a predominance of this in this market, or is the market moving too fast?
So I think that there may have been an uptick, actually, because when you're looking at multiple offers, a lot of times those buyers want to sell the seller on them. And so that's what, from the buyer's side. We don't see it as much from the seller side, but we do see those posted occasionally.
And I think that'll fluctuate with the market. Yeah.
Right. But you're right. They're absolutely red flags. I mean, because the first thing they all say is, oh, my family can't wait to grow up here. Or, you know what I mean? Like something, it's always family related,
Yeah.
always.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that people forget that even when you're promoting the fact that you're a family, that inclusion or exclusion, either side can be fair housing violation.
Right. Right. And thank you for adding that element. I, I try to encourage that they focus on the facts of the offer, the amount, the timing, the things that are not protected class related, in terms of picking who they want to sell to, and really not even passing on these buyer love letters if that can be intervened. If you have the option to not be the conduit for that information, especially, but also
Right.
be the educator to say, there are fair housing laws that prohibit picking on these personal characteristics, but there's lots that we can take into account. Let's look at the timing, let's look at the finances, and move forward from there.
It's also one of the reasons why we moved the buyers' names from being predominant on the first page to buried somewhere in the signature.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And because we do, I do know of a couple of lawsuits that came about because the buyer thought that they were discriminated against because they were a female. Fortunately, the lawsuit was thrown out because the female's name was ambiguous. Like you couldn't tell whether or not it would be a female name or a male name. But there have been lawsuits about that. So it's one of the reasons that we took that predominance off from the first page and moved it down to the signature only, because it doesn't matter who's buying it.
Right. It's a qualified buyer. Right. I have seen race, national origin, and religion cases. Not necessarily gender, but those three for sure, where information disclosed in the back and forth of a home sale was disclosed at a certain point, and then the home sale process stopped, and there was no other reason but for that revelation. And those cases do move forward. Sometimes they're, it can be proven that it was not that identity. It was something else that was not related to the protected class that stopped the sale, but that's certainly something that happens on a handful of times a year, I would say. Here in Michigan, I also should say.
Yes, I'm talking about a case from here in Michigan as well.
Yes, I want to be clear about that. So this is actually a rental case study, I guess, but this is something that HUD recently charged and shared the actual ad with some redacted. They redacted some, I redacted the rest. And again, it kind of speaks to that interest, and sometimes I feel like it's an entitlement. This in the paragraph, let's see here, if you feel you qualify, this individual was collecting a description of the applicants, their race and age, and a picture. Then when HUD accepted this and charged the case, the landlord refused specifically. Then not only do we have the advertising issues here, but then the landlord refused to rent a room in this home to a Black woman who answered the ad, because he said that her race would make his wife and the other tenants uncomfortable. She didn't actually even submit a picture, this applicant, because she knew that this was going, that she didn't have to. So I think this will be a really interesting case, but just a reminder that there is this level of willingness to collect this information and put it out there. So again, just a few best practices, and then, I'm happy to take more questions. Describe the property, not the people. I can't say that enough. Use the equal housing opportunity logo. That's something that HUD is really key on. It's something they consider a tool, and they want to see it used. We've got it on our website. You can download it from there. The other thing is in spaces where housing transactions are conducted, especially in the sales and lending arena, where we have professional spaces dedicated to that business, the equal housing opportunity poster should be displayed HUD doesn't print and send it out anymore, but we will do that for you. So if you look around next time when things are a little more opened up and we're coming and going again, if that's missing, we can help you with that. Just let me know. We'll send out the Actenberg memo, the advertiser's checklist that some of you may have gotten also in April that our center generated. And I just shared a couple other links here that might be of interest. The National Fair Housing Alliance has a page on advertising. And then we've got a ton of information on our website, divided by all sorts of topic areas. So you're welcome to spend time there. But in the interim, are there any questions that we didn't get to in the course of our time together?
I'm not seeing any, but I'm going to give it just a second to see.
Yeah, that's okay. People might be typing.
Yeah, exactly.
This is, you know, I really appreciate everyone's willingness to do this online. I much prefer meeting you all and seeing you in person, but I really appreciate the fact that we can do this together virtually. And also the idea that it can be made available after to the private Facebook group. It's really amazing what technology can allow us to do.
So Liz, it looks like we don't have any further questions. Amanda, do we have any? Oh, wait, no, see, just a, no
Okay.
question, just a thank you.
Oh, that's great, yeah.
No
Well, thank you
questions
very
on
much, Liz. And again, this will be posted in the Facebook group sometime probably tomorrow or the next day.
Okay,
Have a great day, everybody.
thank you so much, you too.